Salutations. Just a quick disclaimer, I am not a conspiracy theorist, and this is purely based on my own interpretation and opinions. I am very pro-science, but I am not very pro-modern science, and I think it is a joke, quite frankly. So, enjoy. Modern academia is in the midst of a naturalistic renaissance, and it has been for the last 40 years. What this means is that, according to modern academia, everything can be explained through scientific inquiry, achieved through research and publishing more research. The Renaissance part refers to the substantial amounts of money pumped into this venture. Naturalism is very much in line with commodifying trends in the modern world at large. Essentially, because everything has a value, is marketable and can be profitable, it is difficult, near impossible, to establish a unifying ethical code of conduct around activities so sparse and diverse. The only real regulatory power that binds us all together in modern societies is bureaucracy. I would say the legal system, but we all know how easy it is for certain individuals and companies to evade taxation or actual prison sentences. But I digress. What is key here is that good and bad are not so easily distinguishable in our contemporary world, and a substantial reason for this is because of commodification. Its reach across every domain of modern life and society is impressive and can make the seemingly neutral field of scientific research just as sketchy as Instagram influencers vouching for laxatives. No, it isn't necessarily a good thing to accept thousands of pounds in order to post about some herbal tea that is going to give you a case of the runs. However, one has to make one's money and pay one's bills, and in this lucrative economy, you need to save for your future, for your inevitable dotage. All in all, commodification has blurred a lot of lines, and modern science is no exception. The commodification of academic research has truly decimated the integrity of scientific research and its proponents. It has undermined the faith which the general public has until quite recently deemed to be a consensual take. Science is always on the side of good. Rather, following the example set by everything else in the modern world, which seems tainted by the normative pros and cons of effectively selling itself for profit, there is a more convincing, cynical, general take on things. Science is always on the side of commerce. According to Hans Rader, in his anthology, The Commodification of Academic Research, Science and the Modern University, the commodification of academic research can be defined as follows. Commodification is identified with commercialization. That is, the pursuit of profit by academic institutions through selling the expertise of their researchers and the results of their inquiries. Academic commodification is part of a comprehensive and long-term social development. This development is often described as the economization or economic instrumentalization of human activities and institutions, or even entire social systems. In this wider and more appropriate sense, academic commodification means that all kinds of scientific activities and their results are predominantly interpreted and assessed on the basis of economic criteria, specifically the dominance of economic criteria, and not their absolute prevalence. There are numerous examples of this in play. A company may fund doctoral research, a country such as Singapore may fund the tuition of its students abroad in exchange for their postgraduate expertise. University departments sign long-term contracts with companies in exchange for funding. Companies establish and fund original professorships and chairs. Scientometrics, namely that which involves the study and analysis of scientific literature, the influence and direction of research and academic journals, has determined the type and content of research. These databases are studied and exploited by private firms for commercial use, and they are studied and exploited by a mere handful of publishing companies for commercial use. Commodification in this sense is widespread in engineering, biological and medical science, and physical science. The humanities and social sciences are no exception. Their business mostly comes from government institutions and select committees. Social sciences such as psychology, economics, and sociology are the bigwigs in this industry. There are too many channels in which academic research has been commodified, and there are bound to be many more. I, however, would like to focus specifically on the economic instrumentalization of academic research and the commodifying habits of those tasked with its production. Increasingly, writes Rada, researchers who are employed by an academic institution are simultaneously running their own businesses. The most obvious way in which these researchers and academics can extract the most profit from this venture is through seeking out a larger audience. Academia, regrettably for them, is a niche specialist environment, and it makes little business sense to market one's research and insights to colleagues in no way impressed by what they already know. They morph their research into bite-sized little gobbets, into quirky diagrams and goofy paragraphs, before then making it onto the Amazon bestseller list for popular science and psychology. So when I was about 17, I went through a bit of an obsession with 3 particularly well-known popular scientists. They are also 3 very well-known and well-established, and at least in the popular science world, respected academics and new atheists: Lawrence Krauss, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris. Alongside Jordan Peterson, these guys are, or were, the big boys of popular science. They've also established and seem to often take for granted the place of naturalism in the modern world. Now, I am not here to argue against their work, as I find most of their work, which I've read, interesting introductory reading to much larger, more complex questions, which they and their publishers definitely don't think will sell as widely if ventured into. What I care about is what their claims to science as an unquestionable social good via their odyssey into popular science means. Let's take Lawrence Krauss, a cosmologist and theoretical physicist who is a popular science beast. In his 2012 bestseller, A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing, Krauss states that quantum mechanics can give an entirely secular and scientific explanation to this age-old philosophical and theological question. At face value, the effort can be appreciated. But Krauss and many of his peers in the popular science world are not merely putting forward their efforts for the greater good. They have marketed their beliefs and theories as truths, because science, digging their heels so deeply into their dogmatic claims that Krauss is able to write a book which literally makes no sense. Science is unable to explain why there is something rather than nothing. Krauss does not in any shape or form answer this question. Rather, he resorts to the age-old philosophical sellout response: we need to transform and change our definition of nothingness. This is just bad philosophy. Quantum theory is also just that. It's a theory. It is not truth. It is not unquestionable fact. It is a theory, it is a belief, it is supported by selective evidence which supports the theory. Where, for instance, do the laws of modern quantum field theories derive from themselves? Also, Krauss' arguments are nothing new or revelatory. They've been made for decades now. John Archibald Wheeler advanced a theory of quantum foam, which basically argued the same thing as Krauss. I do, however, think that there's an important distinction between Wheeler, for instance, and Krauss. Wheeler had a sense of faith that it could be done, namely that it could be discovered via science, why there is something rather than nothing. Faith is the number one element. It isn't something that spreads itself uniformly. Faith is concentrated in few people at particular times and places. If you can involve young people in an atmosphere of hope and faith, then I think you'll figure out how to get the answer. His references to faith and hope have an element of religiosity about them and to them. And this is a very important characteristic and feature of science, of what science genuinely is. It isn't something that you are necessarily selling to an audience. It is something that you have faith and belief in, that you are trying to discover for yourself. In a sense, selling it to yourself, but just without the added bonus of a 6-figure salary. Krauss, on the other hand, and Dawkins and Harris in his own way, they all present themselves as having solved these fundamental questions. They exhibit a kind of arrogance, which I think is more to do with promoting their ideas, with ensuring that other people believe their ideas, as opposed to it necessarily being something inherent within them. This can be seen on their social media feeds, on their merchandising. Jordan Peterson is very much the same in this retrospect. A far more reputable physicist from Columbia University, Professor David Z. Albert, explained it best in his New York Times critique of Krauss' book. It happens that ever since the scientific revolution of the 17th century, what physics has given us in the way of candidates for the fundamental laws of nature have as a general rule simply taken it for granted that there is, at the bottom of everything, some basic, elementary, eternally persisting concrete physical stuff. Newton, for example, took that elementary stuff to consist of material particles, and physicists at the end of the 19th century took that elementary stuff to consist of both material particles and electromagnetic fields, and so on. And what the fundamental laws of nature are about, and all the fundamental laws of nature are about, and all there is for the fundamental laws of nature to be about, insofar as physics has ever been able to imagine, is how that elementary stuff is arranged. The fundamental laws of nature generally take the form of rules concerning which arrangements of what stuff are physically possible and which are not, or rules connecting the arrangements of that elementary stuff at later times to its arrangement at earlier times, or something like that. But the laws have no bearing whatsoever on questions of where the elementary stuff came from, or of why the world should have consisted of the particular elementary stuff it does, as opposed to something else, or to nothing at all. The fact that Sam Harris preaches new atheism whilst also being a practicing Buddhist speaks volumes to me. It shows how flaccid and lacking in something of substance and meaningfulness new atheism is, and naturalism, quite frankly, is. Harris and co. at times seem to find it bizarre that people fanatically or even whimsically believe in deities and the teachings of ancient texts. The God Delusion, as a title, says it all. It is telling that in the age of atheism, globally, religion is flourishing. In the West, traditional religion is waning, but spirituality and mysticism are going through their own renaissance. I don't think it's because their theories are unconvincing that atheism hasn't enveloped the hearts and minds of modern individuals to as extreme an extent as Krauss would want. I completely agree with Sam Harris' arguments in his little gem of a book, Free Will, for instance. But what it does come down to is how their allegiance to science is not so much about truth, reason, and its ability to make the world a better place for all. Their allegiance is to commodified science and what it does for their career prospects, their egos, and their perception of themselves. It gives them a sense of purpose. It is their own irreligious odyssey, and that is all. Most philosophers appreciate this about their work and ideas. Armchair theorizing is a toot and is very self-indulgent. What these three new atheists don't want to acknowledge is that they are themselves the bad philosophers whom they debate and ridicule. In this, their arguments cannot and oftentimes are not trusted beyond their pop science readership. Their credibility is questioned academically once they give their souls to the fame and fortune of mainstream publishing and podcasting. By all means, do that, but don't purport to be doing this in the name of science and truth. This is all in the name of commodified, modern science, which is very different, and which has nothing meaningful to do with truth. So this trend is a booming one and is very relevant to our times. Fake news, conspiracy theories, and everything that can be put under that infamous umbrella culture wars abound. In all this, the March for Science hit the scene in response to the Trump administration's scientific skepticism and climate change denial. So according to their Wikipedia page, the March for Science is a non-partisan movement with the goal of celebrating science and the role it plays in everyday lives, to emphasize that science upholds the common good, and to call for evidence-based policy in the public's best interest. Science is truth, according to the March for Science, and a key part of what gives this claim credibility within the scientific community is its claim to consistency, predictability, and laws. That is, that the same experiment, without fail, will produce the same outcome, that it can be logically inferred every single time that what goes up must come down. On the one hand, then, science is truth. Yet on the other hand, over 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. Within the fields of psychology and cancer biology, rates of reproducibility failed to exceed 40 and 10% respectively. The issue doesn't lie so much in reproducibility, in as much as it lies with a lack of consensus surrounding what science is and ought to be. Of course, falsification is pivotal to science, but there is an important and necessary difference between falsifying what has been proved to work in the interest of progressing further beyond that point, and seemingly generating findings from a flimsy, false foundation. The latter is increasingly where scientific and academic research is starting from. Now, journals have generally been quite reluctant to publish any findings of replication and of a lack of being able to replicate research. Failed attempts at replication are not akin to scientific misconduct, but it definitely is an issue in and of itself which the scientific community needs to address and needs to deal with, but at the moment has not needed to do so or been encouraged to do so, because this goes contrary to funding, to grants, to applying for funding and grants, and is contrary to the objectives of these journals, which is to make profit. So it is increasingly becoming common knowledge that most scientific and intellectual or epistemic discoveries are down to chance and not to rational steps or competence. Some of those things which feature most prominently and actively in our lives were discovered via chance. Penicillin, Viagra, plastic, anesthesia, Coca-Cola, the Big Bang Theory, cornflakes. All these modern phenomena made their way into existence by mere chance. This isn't the real issue. The real issue is that modern science is going through a crisis of credibility. As I said before, this includes the social sciences, specifically economics and psychology, which are both regarded with high esteem when it comes to public policy, financial decisions, and education. This is all centered around replication and the damning findings surrounding the replicability of scientific studies and claims. There is a noticeable disconnect between the Nature Survey's findings relative to modern science's claim to truth and neutrality. This is all down to commodification. Scholars in all disciplines face pressure to produce striking, easily summarized findings that they can effectively promote to a non-specialist audience. That makes it more likely that they'll cut corners rather than derail a promising study. Outright fraud is just the extreme case, and it isn't a rare one. This disconnect is not simply down to chance. Chance is inevitable and it's essential to science. This is about something far more contemporary. In the United States, modern academic scientific research was founded on two principles. Firstly, autonomy, and secondly, internal accountability. Together, this constitutes self-governance as being integral to scientific research. These principles are a 20th century development and have attached to them a policy requirement. Support for research will mostly have to come from the federal government. Companies will never make the necessary investments in undirected research because they cannot capture the economic benefits for themselves. This all emerged out of the Second World War, in which scientific research was in no way self-governing. Scientists were making immense and life-changing breakthroughs directly responsible for the Allied victory in 1945. All these breakthroughs and innovations, penicillin, radar, nuclear weapons of mass destruction, to name a few, were funded for by the US government. Government and industry funding for academic and scientific research went up exponentially. In 1930, this funding totaled $140 million US. By 1940, the total was $309 million US. This was all in pursuit of new scientific knowledge in support of an Allied victory. It was in 1945 that the director of the US Office for Scientific Research and Development, Vannevar Bush, published a key report answering the question, what next for scientific research after the Second World War. In his pretty famous report, Science, the Endless Frontier, which was published in 1945, Bush argued that similarly to how the war was won via government and industry commitment to advancing science by means of increased funding, post-war social issues could be rectified by the continual and just as heavily funded commitment to developing new scientific knowledge in peacetime. Bush's main interest was in the scientific war against disease. Progress in the war against disease depends upon a flow of new scientific knowledge, new products, new industries, and more jobs require continuous additions to knowledge of the laws of nature and the application of that knowledge to practical purposes. Similarly, our defense against aggression demands new knowledge so that we can develop new and improved weapons. This essential new knowledge can be obtained only through basic scientific research. Science can be effective in the national welfare only as a member of a team, whether the conditions be peace or war. But without scientific progress, no amount of achievement in other directions can ensure our health, our prosperity, and security as a nation in the modern world. The policy requirement, however, needed to be altered in peacetime. To truly explore and generate new scientific knowledge into the unknown and barely understood, so-called curiosity-driven research had to be prioritized. Modern scientific research had to therefore place self-governance and its principles of autonomy and internal accountability at the helm. Basically, modern science had to become its own microcosm of anarchist capitalism, completely self-governing. Theoretically, this looks great and uncontroversial. However, it really is controversial. Such curiosity-driven basic science would yield essential but unpredictable benefits at unknowable points downstream, and was an essential prerequisite for solving social problems. The quality of a proposed research project could not therefore be judged by its potential benefits to society. Those were unforeseeable. Scientists would judge scientific merit according to their own internal criteria, but with considerable backing and funding from government and big industry. Bush's report justified and led to the creation of the National Science Foundation in May 1950. Like NASA, founded 8 years after the NSF, it is an independent government agency. The idea of a government agency being independent sounds a little counterintuitive, but this has really worked, at least in meaning. The fact that it works is why it is so easy to see why modern science is so untrustworthy and in genuine crisis. So, under the directive of its founding proponent, Vannevar Bush, modern science has situated itself comfortably within no-strings-attached bedrock principles that are being upheld and reinforced on taxpayers' money, even when, in many cases, no societal benefit whatsoever is demonstrated. All that really matters is the appearance of some sort of societal benefit, which can easily be done through that industry which has transformed a tweed-coat academic into an overnight superstar: publishing. In publishing are the kind of numbers which scientists increasingly need in the marketized world of academia. A published paper represents a physical contribution to something that will one day be of benefit to society. Citation is also key to numbers, and all of this amalgamates into how scientists compete with one another for academic posts, for funding, and for jobs. There is in the scientific community a very misleading and very erroneous conflation between quality and quantity. Apparently, quality equals quantity, and vice versa. Basically saying that productivity is rewarded because producing more must demonstrate that there is, well, obviously better quality inherent in what is being produced, even though this is really not the case. So, as I said, from 1945, the post-World War II era, until about the 1980s, science was not heavily regulated, and therefore scientific misconduct was not heavily regulated by the US government. The scandal in scientific misconduct in 1981 resulted in the government taking a more active role and response to scientific misconduct, not necessarily perceiving it anymore as just a few bad apples or bad examples of scientists and scientific conduct, but rather seeing it as potentially a serious and far deeper and more common problem. No more is science about the common good and benefiting society. Corporate interests determine the direction of scientific research. But why is this? Well, I think this is down to two reasons. Firstly, academic life and jargon are highly exclusive. Most of society does not have access into this world. Academia is often described as a bubble, and going out of that bubble is a very transformative and odd experience. I can say that from personal experience. Secondly, I would say that this is down to the universal standardization of science. This has established scientific norms that are never questioned. The Web of Science is a prolific online database with over 171 million records. Its speciality is citation data. It is owned and kept up to date by Clarivate Analytics, a public company born out of the merging of private equity firms Onyx Corp and Barings Private Equity Asia in 2016. The company and its shareholders keep its focus on scientific and academic research, patent analysis, regulatory standards, trademark protection, pharmaceutical and biotechnology intelligence, domain brand protection, and intellectual property management. Clarivate is an information industry. And, in crude terms, churning out information is the goal here, and this doesn't necessarily have to be good information. In my opinion, to be a good and genuine scientist, one has to be just as good and genuine a philosopher. And in order to communicate with society, you have to be able to communicate ideas, not just facts. In June 2020, a scientific paper was published in the European Respiratory Journal. The authors claimed that current smoking was not associated with adverse outcome in patients admitted to hospital with COVID. The paper also openly claimed that smokers were at less risk of being infected with the virus, contrary to non-smokers. It was only in April of this year that the academic journal retracted the article after it was discovered that these two authors had financial interests and ties to the tobacco industry. Prior to publishing the paper, both authors wrote none in conflict of interests. Apparently, there were no conflicts of interest, even though both of them are involved in consulting and leading investigations into vaping, e-cigarettes, and smoking in general, all funded by the tobacco industry. Retractions are not a rare thing at all. Retraction Watch database, which is an online platform that has been recording and collecting data and information and numbers on how many scientific and academic papers are retracted every single year, has documented this very case. From January 2000 to January 2021, 29,602 academic papers were retracted. Considering the amount of funding that goes into individual projects which produce individual papers, this is a considerable amount of money and investment wasted not just by scientists themselves, but also by private sector investors. In the last few weeks, for instance, Dan Ariely, a renowned behavioral psychologist and professor at Duke University, came under fire. Accusations of scientific misconduct were leveled at Ariely, following evidence which showed that his entire study and the thesis behind books that he has published on dishonesty in human beings was based on fraudulent and fake datasets. This dataset was based on information Ariely obtained from a car insurance company, basically being asked to confirm the trustworthiness and truthfulness of information before giving it, as opposed to afterwards, usually with a signature, ensured greater levels of truthfulness. According to Ariely, Ariely's findings in this sense were endorsed by a startup insurance company called Lemonade. Lemonade incorporated this into its contractual agreements. Ariely also, since 2016, has been their official behavioral officer. The company is branded as a public benefit company, is aimed at millennials, and has endorsed the principles which Ariely set out in the study and in his book on dishonesty. A conflict of interests indeed. Ariely's reputation has been irreparably damaged, as has the reputation of many a pop scientist and professor before him. There is definitely something very much wrong with modern commodified science and with our unquestionable and unquestioning allegiance to it. Publication bias and selective publishing has made it difficult to detect or even prove that the problem exists in as profound a form as it does. And in itself, it represents how the underlying principles of modern science have placed it into a rut, which it doesn't actually have to solve. Yes, there is a problem, but there are no dire or really meaningful consequences to not solving the problem. Money is still being made, profit is still being made, and research is still happening, even if the research in most cases is false, flimsy, and quite frankly, meaningless. Academic science is only ever put into direct public scrutiny when, I don't know, a global pandemic hits. And even when that happens, the bureaucracy and going down the rabbit hole of this academic science, the ethics and the meta-science behind it, is so overly complicated that, well, nothing meaningful really happens. It is no wonder that conspiracy theorists are making it big these days. The credibility or lack thereof of science is largely down to replication. Replication is something that modern science has failed miserably at. And this goes unquestioned because modern science is almost completely unregulated. Rather than the deregulation of science and scientific research resulting in the autonomy and the internal scrutiny and freedom of science, it has not led to the curiosity-driven notions of scientific discovery which is purported to be leading to. Instead, curiosity-driven research has been replaced with profit-driven research. It has also brought forth a flood of what I would call scientists' claim articles, and these are, as I said, flooding media outlets. Scientists claim one thing one day, and that makes big news until it is forgotten once something else more enticing comes. Claimed, of course, by scientists elsewhere. Private research companies and venture capitalists invest heavily in scientific research. And this is largely because of what it promises: profit and a better future, largely for them. A 2015 PLOS survey found that over $28 billion is invested into scientific research that cannot be replicated every single year. That's $28 billion. Wow. And world hunger has been on the increase since 2014. This world is such a better place, honestly. But if we look more specifically at, say, artificial intelligence, the stupidity also becomes clear. Trends show that investment in AI projects by private companies and by federal governments are increasing considerably, whilst at the same time, the success rate of these AI projects is decreasing. Last year, companies invested $50 billion into AI research globally, and this is predicted to raise to $110 billion by 2024. The relationship may be toxic and contradictory, but it pays. And that is the problem with commodified and marketized science and academia as well. Modern science claims to be making the world a better place. It claims to be on the side of progress and in discovering truth. Hell, some popular scientists claim to have even discovered that truth and to have come to the end of history in the sense of scientific discovery. I don't know, but I think that modern science will start to impress me and convince me once it gets its priorities straight. As I've said, global hunger, which now, for the first time in modern history, includes first world countries, has been increasing since 2014. Whilst governments, companies, and popular scientists are allegedly making the world a better place for all through science.
Der Staatsmann wird umgeben, eingekreist von einem Heer von Experten. Und eigentlich wäre hier die Frage zu stellen zwischen dem Staatsmann und dem Experten. Der Staatsmann muss ja schließlich die Entscheidung treffen. Er muss es nehmen von Experten, und zwar von Experten, die sich prinzipiell immer widersprechen müssen. Nicht jeder vernünftige Staatsmann holt sich die entgegengesetzten Expertisen ein. Dazwischen muss er urteilen.
My problem here is with the false claim of virtuosity, which modern science clearly is not one to speak of. There is an evident wastefulness in the entire enterprise, and unfortunately, it is picking away at genuine scientific discovery and purpose. It is picking away at good academic writing. It is picking away at good popular writing. And the university as an institution of learning, of curiosity-driven research, of genuine academic ventures is being decimated and significantly and irreparably undermined by this market mentality which has taken over any potential of genuine research, making this world a better place for us all. So, while I laugh, I would love to hear what you think and your opinions on this. Are you a scientist? Have you been a part of scientific research or the scientific community in more intimate and knowing a way than I have or will ever be? Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. And thank you so much for making it to the end. That's impressive. I could hardly make it to the end. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.